When I started at Weinstein, it was 2010. I was 17. Whenever Harvey came to the LA office, he would move through the office like a very slow moving shark. People were like ducking into their offices literally and just like trying to keep as low a profile as possible because nobody wanted his scrutiny.
Welcome to the Storied Future Podcast, a show where I talk to high-performing CEOs, experts, and innovators who use the power of storytelling to shift the future. If you want to find and tell the stories that have the power to change you, change others, and change the world, this is the show for you.
I remember walking into the office in LA and everyone was super quiet. And I was like, what is going on? And I sit at my desk and my boss comes by and he's like, there's this big story in the New York Times. I think they got him.
That's Sienna Jackson, a Los Angeles-based founder, social impact consultant, producer, and extraordinary human. And I'm lucky enough to call her a friend.
I read it. I was like, oh my God, this company is run by a monster. I would have been like 23 or 24.
During her career in entertainment and music, Sienna worked on multiple Academy Award and Golden Globe nominated original soundtracks, featuring music from artists such as Pharrell Williams, Taylor Swift, U2, Iggy Pop, Eminem, and many others.
And then once he was out, it was actually kind of scary because he became almost like the ex-boyfriend in a Lifetime movie where it's like, if I can't have you, no one can. And when I say that, I mean to say he was hiring like ex-Mossad agents to like stalk people.
While she was at Weinstein, Sienna made a name for herself by uncovering hidden risk and profits in the company's music rights contracts.
And Harvey comes in again with all the assistants like darting around. He ends up sitting down next to me.
Today, Sienna and her coworkers are shifting the narrative around how bias, discrimination, and abuse are uncovered and addressed in the workplace. Let's dive in. Well, Sienna, thanks so much for joining me on the Storied Future Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. I'm really excited to be here.
Been looking forward to this for quite a while. Before we get into your story, I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about who you are, but without talking about what you do.
That's a good one because, you know, so much of who we are as people, I think, we're defined by what we do. I'm a very family-oriented, driven, diligent, hard worker. I'm an Aquarius, so I always am, and I've got big dreams and kind of visions for life in the future. And I'm also a person who, in order to ground themselves when they're thinking about the future, I'll go on hikes. I try to stay connected to nature. I love being physically active. I used to do martial arts and horseback riding and figure skating. So kind of in a lot of ways a cliche SoCal girly because I try to stay active, but I'm also a cliche Aquarius because I'm always dreaming about what is possible. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
What were you like as a kid in terms of how you thought about the future?
This has been pointed out to me by family and friends. I'm basically very much the same person now as I was as a kid. I was just very pragmatic, very proactive. I was always a hard worker. I was always thinking about things that I could be doing or should be doing or could get started on right now that would have some big payoff in the future. Like when I was 9, I was planning where I was going to go to college. When I was, 10 or 11, I thought, oh, I'm going to work at NASA or I'm going to do this, that, or the other thing. So basically the same. I'm just really interested in learning and growing and what could be achievable in the future if I just put the work into it.
That's what I was going to ask is what, if you recall at, 9 years old, what do you feel like fueled that? Was it a love of learning or was it like, what do you think the underlying emotion or belief was?
I think it was learning and the idea that if, you had an education, if you understood a problem, you could solve it. So, growing up as a kid, I was a big reader. I think like 3 days into first grade, my mom was like, this isn't working for you, is it? And I was like, no. So she pulled me out and I was homeschooled. So I had a lot of control over my education, what I was learning. I was like clearing through grade levels, on a quarterly basis, it felt like. So by the time I was like 11 or 12, I was already at a college age reading level. I was kind of ready to test out of high school level and start college, but I took a sabbatical from school just to work in a Shakespearean theater company, like an independent Shakespeare company in Silver Lake. So that was like 12, 13. So yeah, growing up, I was always really motivated, and I always knew that I was smart, and I always believed that you could use your intellect in ways that were really beneficial to the world, or you could do really anything with your smarts. I grew up believing that. And I don't know if it was definitely a combination of my parents being very supportive of me, but then also just like the sort of media and storytelling I was exposed to. So as a kid, I really loved Matilda, girl who was so smart. She literally had psychic powers and could fight for justice and change the world around her. I really liked Harriet the Spy. I thought, I could do that. So I was kind of that kid who would see things in stories and think, I could do that. That absolutely is achievable. Let me think about it some more and go to my journals and write a plan. And, I'll scheme and it'll happen.
I love that. I used to be, I don't know when I figured this out, but I skipped first grade. And then I think I was in like third or fourth grade spelling in first grade. And I remember thinking, it took me years after that to realize that probably wasn't a big deal. But for years I was like, there's something really special about me. Like the world needs to know that I'm good at spelling.
I love because it's I think it's an important feeling that kids, most kids have. And then for some reason they might lose, but you should always kind of feel like unique and special and different and most importantly, capable. I think if you imbue kids with a sense of their own capability and competence and you nurture that, then you're going to have people who are like really just effective and healthy minded when it comes to thinking about their own capabilities later in life.
As you're talking about your childhood, it definitely brings me a lot of joy thinking about the fact that world where a kid feels that confidence and empowerment and ability to dream and that creativity, because that's not often the case. But I love how there's that through line of like, who I am now is who I was then. And you grew up in that world. That's just beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah. And hopefully I'm a little bit more mature. Well, that remains to be seen.
What was play like for you as a kid? Obviously you studied a lot, but what was the play and creativity side in that world? How did that manifest?
I mean, I did art, I wrote, I created diagrams of inventions because I thought I was an inventor at one point. It was very like my mother's an artist, my father's a musician, my whole family works in entertainment. So I kind of grew up around creatives, doing the arts. I did Shakespeare. So I was like a theater kid as well. So I was doing I did some musical theater. So I was always doing art and performance and thinking about the arts as tied to everything else I was doing. Cause I also, growing up, I was really interested in polymath, like, Da Vinci or, Benjamin Franklin, people who wore a lot of hats, who would be like, scientists, inventors, artists, political leaders, philosophers. So I was really interested in people like that. And I thought, that is something that I should also strive to be. So I was always thinking of myself in those terms of, let's just acquire all these different interests and activities and hobbies, and it'll all kind of come together eventually. I also I read a lot of like Austen and sort of Edwardian, like social commentary stuff. So I also liked, the My Man Jeeves stories, like P.G. Wodehouse, like very satirical sort of stuff. So I would call myself an accomplished young woman of many accomplishments. I was a very entertained kid. I was never bored growing up. Like I was never, ever without things to do or think about.
The inventor part really it reminded me, we had this family friend and I believed same thing. I'm like, I'm going to invent something. And he totally humored me. He was an engineer and I went over there and he spent hours with me and I was designing a fire detector. I'm like, it's not a smoke detector. Like if we could detect fire, like That would be amazing. And so we spent hours drawing this thing, and then I finally realized, and without him telling me, I'm like, it's kind of like a smoke detector. Because the smoke is a leading indicator.
Yeah.
But anyway, but that encouragement of that, I remember he went dumpster diving at his work because they built really specialized motors for like fighter planes and submarines and things like that, and brought me this phenomenal motor, and we ended up building a wind tunnel. It was for my science fair project.
That's
built a wind
incredible.
tunnel with this motor. And I remember my very first wing that I tested flew down instead of up.
But that's the point, right? It's you fail, you try and you fail. I think that that anecdote, I love that because that's such an engineer sort of attitude of, hey, let's try, let's dumpster dive, let's get a bunch of junk together and see what happens. Like, I've got a lot of engineer friends, and that seems like a common attitude towards failure and trying and being curious and not just checking your curiosity at the door. It's like, hey, I've got an idea. Let's follow this as far as we can take it and then see if it works and reserve judgment until after we test it out.
Just an observation as we were talking is the way I'm wired is to think about, and going back to when I was a kid, is to think about success versus failure. And I loved what you said about the engineer, because it's more of an approach of like learning, right? Versus like, that's not a failure. That's just part of the learning process, right? And as you were telling your story, I saw this picture of you of like, here's this future that you imagine. And it really is kind of, that's what animates you. That's what pulls you along. And so the things that you're doing are just, hey, these are little bumps on the way to that future.
Oh, yeah. Like, I never planned to work in entertainment. That was not the plan. Like, I wanted first to be an astrophysicist. I wanted to be an archaeologist. I wanted to be an Egyptologist. I wanted to be a paleontologist. I wanted to work at NASA. I wanted to be a spy. I wanted to be a journalist. I was really interested in journalism and international relations when I started college. So like from like 14 to 17, I was, writing about the Arab Spring. I was doing all this stuff. And at the tail end of my getting that first degree, I got the internship at Weinstein. I was like, oh, I don't want to work in entertainment. I want to be different than everyone else in the family. So I was just going in as an intern for college credit. And by that time, they just had a huge round of layoffs. So most of the offices at the time were on the Miracle Mile, and it was quite empty. It was like very dim and very empty. Like the offices themselves were a great location, like right across from the tar pits and all that. And the music department was like 2 people. It was Richard Glasser and Beth Humphreys. And, the music library, such as it was, a bunch of banker's boxes filled with contracts and acquisition agreements, which maybe in one paragraph of one particular schedule would mention, hey, by the way, acquiring this film, you have the rights to the music, or you have the rights not to the recordings, you have the rights to the underlying composition, or you have the rights to the recordings, but not the underlying composition as in the publishing rights. So we had these boxes of documents that would maybe slip in a mention of our music rights for all the different film and TV titles in our library. And then we had an actual library of like 25 MP3s on an old Macintosh, like with the shell. And I was like, okay, so what's the big problem that I could figure out is, okay, we have intellectual property rights for a bunch of music, like Alexander Desplat scores, like we had some rights to, I think, Akira Kurosawa films, or like rights to adapt. We had like amazing rights. We'd acquired a lot of rights, but no one had gone through to like catalog everything that we owned, and therefore everything we could make money with. So that was like my first job, was sorting CDs that would be sent to us from different labels and management companies and publishers, and be like, oh, this would be cool for a movie. I like this song a lot. I like this artist. And then I'd just be doing research on our IP. So my job from almost from the get-go, before I even officially started working there, was in their IP and building up their music library, which by the time all things were said and done, had netted us we were getting Academy Award and Gold nominations almost every year while I was there, from like 2010 to 2017, because that was like King's Speech through Hateful Eight. So it was an amazing run. It was King's Speech, The Artist, Silver Linings Playbook, Project Runway, Scream, Scary Movie. We were working with everybody and doing a lot of really great stuff. And I was just in the background cataloging all the music we had rights to, which by the end of my tenure at Weinstein, I think it was netting us like 1.2 million a year in just passive like income, just like royalty and sync licensing was a smaller part of our business, but one that I was hoping to grow. So we were just netting. We were a profit center and an awards driving center for the studio. And we were like 2 people for most of that time, me and Richard.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So we were really punching above our weight class, and it got a lot of attention. And that way, even through the bankruptcy, when some of the new ownership came in, they were talking to me. They're like, so how well is the library performing during this bankruptcy? You're still making money? Okay, cool. Well, you can come on to the new ship. So I was part of even the transition, the merger and acquisition by Lantern Entertainment, which then became Gary Barber and Spyglass jumped on, as well as a lot of his old people from MGM.
Well, there's a really interesting foreshadowing there of one, you were seeing value that no one else saw that was there. You were uncovering value that they were just sitting on, right? And then you brought order to it. But then also I imagine there's also risks there, which also there's risks in the way they were managing. There's risks hidden in the contracts. And you also identified those, which is.
Absolutely. Well, here's the thing. It's like when you're owning something that people had like heretofore not seen the value in, then you have to make the case of, hey, this is going to pay off and be valuable, right? You have to advocate to internal stakeholders. So a lot of the work I would do unprompted would be I'd be calling up executives in other departments being like, hey, I'm Sienna, I'm music. Can you please send me all these agreements that you have sitting probably in a banker's box, please? So I was doing a lot of diplomacy across departments. I was talking a lot to the awards team. I was talking a lot to PR. I was talking a lot to acquisitions and physical production finance. I was talking to all of our departments, and I was asking to be part of calls. And it was really cool because, my boss, the only boss I've ever had, Richard, super cool, born in 1947, right? He was hanging out with Stevie Wonder and Quincy Jones back in the day. There's a great picture of him and Stevie with both of them with their little afro, Richard with his little Jew-fro and a gold chain. And then the 70s collar, and him and Stevie, who also had like a baby fro at the time. Because I think he was around, Richard was when Stevie was doing like Songs in the Key of Life and, that whole era. So just like a iconic sort of person. And when I came on board at 17, he immediately recognized my potential and was like, oh yeah, you can just listen in on all of my calls to learn how to negotiate a deal. You're going to be CC'd on all of my emails. You're going to go to events and we're going to get you on the invite list. So I would go out to him for shows and screenings and album release parties. So I was meeting everybody. And then eventually I developed enough of a network where I was on the invite list and I was just going to shows and parties and album, release playback listening sessions and just going all over town. So I'd be out 3 or 4 nights a week till 2 a.m. going to shows. Awesome. And then I'd roll into the office the next day at 10, kind of get started at 11. I remember one time I was at my desk having lunch. This was maybe 2015, 2016. And Isaac Mizrahi, who was director, he was post-production, walks by my desk and he's like, are you ready to shoot the music video tonight? And I'm like, what music video? And he's like, oh, Adam Levine's going to be at the London, up the street. And we're going to be shooting, we're going to do some playback stuff for Sing Street. There was a movie Sing Street we were working on. Harvey said you had it. And I'm like, okay. And then I put my sandwich down and I'm like, well, let's figure out. And then how we're doing this and what is actually the ask here. And that night I was at the London in West Hollywood playing back some of the original songs from the film off of my iPhone as the actors were lip syncing And we were doing like a cute, like, oh, like all these kids have infiltrated the London and they're dancing around and they're singing. And Adam Levine is like sitting next to me, just rolling a mountain of blunts saying, you know, I had my prom here. I had my high school prom here. It was really nice, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, that's cool, Adam. Like, yeah, you know, I never did prom. You know, how was your prom? He's like, oh, it was really good, blah, blah, blah. I like this one. So I'm like, oh, I like this place too. So that's like one story. I had, when I was working on the Crouching Tiger sequel for Netflix, we were doing, it was very international. It was like a Chinese co-production. And we were hiring Coco Lee, you know, the late great Coco Lee, who was like the Madonna of China, and a few other artists to do this original song. It was an Irish writer, like a UK woman who was writing the song in English on the plane to Macau, I think is where we recorded it. And it was being translated into Mandarin in real time. I was at the office in LA at like 3 a.m. because I had hired the producer, who was Japanese, and we also had the composer, Shigeru Umebayashi, also Japanese. And for a while, it was like, I need to find an English-speaking rep for Shigeru Umebayashi. All I could find was like this Tokyo number. So I taught myself enough Japanese to be like, oh, ohayou gozaimasu, eigo ga hanashimasu ka? And so I was like talking in Japanese to get the ball rolling on negotiating the deal. We finally get an English-speaking rep, so I handed it over to Richard to negotiate the composer agreement. And then finding the producer, Ichiro Suezawa, I think, was the producer of the original song. So getting all these people on planes to fly to Macau to meet Coco in the studio and record the original song. And basically the whole process of like getting everyone wrangled and together was like 48 hours. And that was like me. And then I was like, you know, me and Richard, I think we ordered Genghis Cohen, which is like this kind of Jewish Chinese, like it's like this classic institution Chinese place on Fairfax. So we ordered Genghis Cohen and we were just at the office at our desks, just eating Chinese food as we're waiting for this song to be recorded. I got another one where we were working on Marco Polo, at the time it was like the most expensive television show Netflix had ever done. And it was about the adventures of the Italian explorer Marco Polo in the court of, I think, Genghis Khan, or one of his descendants. And it's ironic because I had published some academic research on the Ilkhans, so like the Islamic Ilkhan, Mongol Ilkhans of Iran. So I was already familiar with, you know, some of the history and culture. And I was also familiar through, again, my diverse academic background with Mongolian throat singing. So like this two-toned, I can't do it. It's an art form, but polyphonic, where you're producing with your one voice a low tone, like a bass note, and like a high whistle tone at the same time. So it's this very guttural, like it sounds like wind through like a string, like a reed instrument. It's a very unique art form. And it's, you know, a lot of cultures have it. Tibet has polyphonics. The Mongolians have polyphonics. So for Marco Polo to give that kind of authentic sound, we're talking about the Mongol people, you can't have a soundtrack without Mongolian throat singing. So I'm like going on YouTube and watching like different Mongolian performers. And then, you know, we find the band Altan Urag. So they're in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. Very, very great, like Mongolian rock band. They do like the heavy metal with the Mongolian, like with the polyphonics, with the throat singing.
Wow.
But we need to get a hold of them. So I had to write an email in Mongolian Cyrillic and send that via like a Facebook DM to the management. And it worked. And eventually, I think even Richard got some sort of cultural award for the support of Mongolian culture from the government. And they were like, you want to come out to Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia? And Richard was like, I don't think I can do that, but thank you very much for this honor. So it was just like, it was always fun to work with artists that would never usually get a call from Hollywood. It was always fun to be like, yeah, no, I'm legitimately someone from a Hollywood studio and I want to work with you on this big Netflix show. Like, let's work together. That was always like the best part of the job. And then like getting to see, you know, growing up in LA, you see celebrities all the time, but it is cool to be in different environments that are more casual, or go to an album release party and, oh, there's the Weeknd in the corner just being like, what do you think? And you're just like, okay, this is cool. It was all really fun.
Was there an album or an artist as a kid that was really formative for you, and whether on your own or with your parents, and then you got to meet them or hear them like once you were grown up?
Yeah. I mean, my dad is a drummer. He's a director and producer in television, but he's always, at heart a drummer first. I think he opened for Iggy Pop like way back in the day when he was kind of in that post-punk alternative scene. And then I got to work with Iggy Pop on Gold, which is like the Matthew McConaughey, I think it was like a heist movie. And Iggy wrote an original song for that movie. And I got a signed copy of the sheet music, of the lyrics and notes. So I got it signed and I brought it home to my dad in a manila envelope. And I'm like, this is a full circle moment. Open this up, see what this is. And he opens it up. And as soon as he sees that it's Iggy, it's like, oh my God. So he still has that framed. So I love things like that. That's really fun.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What was you've talked about what the state of things were when you arrived and the transformation in terms of how you took charge of things. What was the culture like there at Weinstein when you arrived?
Yeah, I think for most people, it was very fast paced and very stressful because everyone, I used to liken it to like almost like a court where Harvey was king and then all of the executives were like the courtiers they were in court. And so there was a lot of like intrigue and, I'm sure there was a lot of politics and, I don't know how heated it got. I never went to the New York office, which was kind of like the seat for him. I was always in LA, which was David Glasser's, zone. And David Glasser is the son of Richard Glasser, my boss. So it was like I was in that Glasser bubble of, me and Richard just having fun. And he was like my work grandpa. So I was very insulated, I think, from a lot of the toxicity. But it was definitely there because whenever Harvey came to the LA office, people were like ducking into their offices literally and just like trying to keep as low a profile as possible because nobody wanted his scrutiny. Nobody wanted to be like called out by him. Nobody wanted to be like given, the third degree of like, why haven't you done this? Why haven't you done that? Like, why is it that, okay, like you need to get on the phone with them, all right? And like fix this and like da-da-da. So he was a very like oppressive energy. And he had this like entourage of assistants. Like the HW office was like always like 4 or 5 people, like, different assistants that would kind of like circle around him. So he would move through the office like a very slow moving shark. And then you'd have all these pilot fish darting around him, just executing and getting things done. And, me and Richard would just be in music. Although I was one of his direct reports actually, because when I was like 20, Harvey had summoned the music department to the Peninsula, which is where he would bring a lot of the departments, because he would just stay there when he was in LA. So it was a breakfast meeting and I was like 20 years old. We were sat down at this like long breakfast table in a private like dining hall at the Peninsula. And Harvey comes in again with all the assistants like darting around. He sits down. He ends up sitting down next to me and I'm like, and then he starts grilling us on performance and this, that, and the other. And he talks about the music catalog. And he's like, he points to me, he's like, that's you, right? You're in charge of that, right? And then I'm like, well, I'm doing X, Y, Z, and here's how we're performing, Harvey. Here's like our numbers. He's like, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And I was, answering his questions. And he's like, okay, from now on, you're going to email me every week about what you're doing and what's going on here, because I want to understand everything that's going on. So I then, from that point on, was sending him like these weekly updates. And I know he read them because at the bottom, I would have like, hey, here are some artists that I think are really interesting, or here's some stuff that I think is really cool, or here's like, my recommendations. And I would hear through the grapevine, oh, Sienna put Chance the Rapper in her like, hey, this is the music or the new releases I'm listening to this week. Harvey now is getting a meeting with Chance the Rapper. Like, so I was doing some like tastemaker stuff. So that ended up being the extent of my contact with him, was like these emails. And occasionally he would write back like some directive or some, instruction of, for the awards campaign for this film, we want to work with, Diane Warren on an original song, or I want this, or I want that. And then me and Richard would talk it over, and it's like, okay, how do we make this actually happen from like an email directive to like something that is tangible? So that was a lot of what people had to do at that company. Is, we were always small. We were always punching way above our weight class. We were a mini major studio. We were doing major projects with basically no infrastructure or budget. So everyone was really good at problem solving and making things happen out of nowhere with no warning and no support, basically. It was always a mad scramble to get things done and execute, this one person's vision out of like, and it would just come out of nowhere like a bolt from the blue. You'd be like, oh, Harvey wants this. So everyone's just scrambling to get Harvey what he wants. So there's like no time. Everyone was just like running around, it felt like.
I'm curious how, when you're in the presence of someone that is toxic in however that manifests, I'm curious what that does to you internally. Like, how does that impact you internally?
I think definitely, again, I lucked out because I had a good rapport with him. I never witnessed the worst of him. So a lot of the stories, like the most crazy stories about him I heard, came after. And it would be from executives who were in New York with him. And then, because of Me Too and his ouster, they suddenly felt safe to like share, oh yeah, this happened and this happened, or he screamed at me, or he did this. And it's like, oh my God. So I never dealt with the worst with him, especially since I was like literally a teenage girl at that company. I was the youngest person that he could possibly interact with. So I really feel fortunate in the sense that I did not have that sort of experience there. But it was stressful. And it was the sort of environment where if you're not careful and you internalize it too much, you'll be like, you give yourself like heartburn or indigestion. And I think a lot of my colleagues were like really stressed. The ones that were dealing with the brunt of his, anger or pressure from him, those are the people who were really stressed. And then they would, kind of lash out at other people. So I've even had some executives that were in New York who had to deal with him all the time reach out to me and be like, hey, you were always super nice and were always like really lovely to me. And I don't think I was very nice to you. And I want you to know that it bothers me and I'm sorry. And I'm like, you're forgiven and I understand. So for me, it was good. But again, I think I give a lot of credit to Richard and to David and to being kind of a pseudo granddaughter to Richard that really insulated me from a lot.
That's really beautiful to have somebody come back to you after the fact because of how you showed up in the world. And I mean that, and making that difference. And then, I mean, the F word, forgive, like that's not a word in your industry that I'm guessing a lot of people hear.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
There's a lot of
like
egos.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah. It's a lot of ego. So for me, I was like, because remember, my goal wasn't entertainment. My goal was maybe to work for CIA, maybe to go report on war zones. So I was always able to reframe it as stressful as a day at the office could be. It's not life and death. Like, we're not making decisions that could literally get people killed, which was what I was originally going for. So it's in the grand scheme of things, this is how I would tell myself. It's like, in the grand scheme of things, this is actually pretty chill. This is a great job. So
you came in one day and there was the story in the paper. What happened, that day and in the days that followed?
So like, I remember walking into the office in LA and everyone was super quiet. And I was like, what is going on? And I sit at my desk and my boss at the time, who I love and is a wonderful person and human being, Richard Glasser, he comes by and he's like, there's this big story in the New York Times. I think they got him. I think something is really going to happen. And I'm like, let me read this article and figure out what's really going to happen. And I read it. I was like, oh my God. This company is run by a monster. So it's crazy to go into work and then have your workplace be national news that everybody was talking about, not just in your industry, like your peers or colleagues, people you know, but then like you go into, Erewhon or Shake Shack and you'd be sitting in line and people would be talking about the headlines and you're like, oh my God, I'm at the epicenter of something just massively impactful. Because so much has happened since Me Too. And there's been such a journey when it comes to the state of feminism and women's rights in this country and the conversations around women's rights. But that was such an inflection point, an important like pre-pandemic inflection point where people were really thinking about power structures and how companies, even ones that on the surface seem so progressive and so beneficial and impactful, are really, covering up the wrongdoings of people in power, or can be used as sort of scaffolding to hide other activities behind the scenes. So it was just like, that was my first encounter with like just a massive problem. And even though I was I was like, again, 23 or 24, I still felt a sense of responsibility of, first of all, how do we assess like how many people were hurt? So like, I remember in the immediate aftermath of the story coming out, there were so many women, especially in the LA office, who were like either junior like me, like junior executives, or more senior. And we all took a conference room and got together and we were like checking on each other. Like, are you okay? Did anything happen to you? Like blah, 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 blah. And as more and more stories came out, there was a lot of work behind the scenes led by a lot of the women executives, going to the board and being like, if he's not out of this company by the end of the weekend, you're going to lose most of your studio in one fell swoop because everyone's going to leave. And he was out. And then once he was out, it was actually kind of scary because he became almost like the ex-boyfriend in a Lifetime movie where it's like, if I can't have you, no one can. And when I say that, I mean to say he was hiring like ex-Mossad agents to like stalk people. Jeez. He was like, we had the FBI talk to us at one point and was like, we can't do anything until something happens, but you need armed security at your office. So at the LA office, we had like an armed guard in case anything happened. Even I got an email that looked like it was from Bob Weinstein, and it wasn't, but it was like asking for a phone call. And I go to my boss, I go to Richard, I'm like, I got this creepy email. I was like forward that to HR. That's definitely something nefarious. And I was just like, here's a problem that I can't just smart my way out of because it's bigger than me. And it's an institutional problem. And that's when I kind of realized that so many ills in this world and so many things that require change, require like systemic systems change. It requires a huge coalition coming together to make the change. It can't be an individual solving and fixing on her own. You need like an entire movement to even chip at the iceberg. And that's what Me Too started to do. Whether it fulfilled the full mission, I don't think it did, but it was a huge moment, I think, for American culture, like a reckoning when it comes to just how women are treated in society. It became a very big conversation, and I was, grateful that it happened. We all kind of went to ground. We were checking in on each other. We pushed for him to be out. He did not take that very well. And then, it was the scramble to find new owners, hopefully American owners that would keep the company alive and keep people, because there were people that had basically grown up their whole careers there who had families and it was like a lot of livelihoods at stake because, people at Weinstein were not paid. We were not being paid the big bucks. So we were very much like a middle class, mini major sort of team. So it was saving those people's jobs was the focus. It was making sure that people were safe, that people had not and if anyone had been harmed, that harm was being addressed. So there was a community that kind of came together And, a lot of those people have moved on to other things, better things, other companies, sometimes other companies that also have these same industry problems of big egos and people and toxicity. But, that was really the thing. It was just kind of weathering the storm and making sure that nobody got kidnapped or something. It was crazy to have the armed guard because it was intense.
So you've talked about this narrative of the tortured genius in the entertainment industry. What role do you think that plays in perpetuating harmful beliefs? Beyond
that, even it's the myth of the great man. The great man who's the charismatic leader, and we can excuse some bad behavior because that's his eccentricity and that's part of his process. And he is a genius, and he has a lot of success under his belt. But that sort of archetype is prevalent not just in entertainment. It's since leaving the industry, I've been working in all these different other sectors. You see that mythology play out across culture. It's that's more of a cultural thing in the United States. It's the myth of literally pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and success is a moral consequence. That the good are successful, and then if you're poor, if you're not successful, maybe there's some moral wrong where you deserve this lack of success. So that has been a part of the American psyche since the beginning, because that's just a very dated sort of Protestant prosperity doctrine belief. But yeah, that great man mythology is universal. And I think we need to dismantle it on a broader scale, because it's not just an entertainment industry issue. In fact, none of the things that I used to think that a lot of the things that I noticed about the industry were strictly of the industry. They're not. These are universal issues. And they're sector non-specific. They're cultural.
That's interesting. So if I'm hearing you correctly, there's the great man who's doing great good, and it's okay to commit evil on the path to doing that, as long as you're making a ton of money for your investors, or as long as you're building this great technology that's going to change the world.
Or as long as you're making America great again, or as long as you're taking back, you know what I mean? That, we have a certain weakness to those sort of bellicose figures, those larger than life figures. And it's something that we have to reconcile. What is it about us culturally that gravitates towards the big, almost bully pulpit sort of figures? Why do we need to have that energy? And why do we see that as leadership? Why do we see that as strength? Why do we see that as powerful, when really one article and all of the people, and then the rug gets ripped out from under you, and you're not actually that strong. You're not actually that powerful.
We don't learn. We don't seem to learn.
We don't seem to learn. So that's been a really fascinating thing about my transition, is my entire entertainment career is so relevant every day to the work I do now, where it kind of proves my original childhood thesis of it's okay to wear a lot of hats. It's okay to have a lot of interests, and it's okay to follow and pursue any old thing that, strikes your fancy. It will become relevant inevitably. So that a lot of the stuff that I've experienced, even pivoting careers, has proven out that thesis that I was developing as a kid.
I'm also struck too by, you have a phenomenal resume, and looking at you, I would bet on you. A lot of people would bet on you. But if you also look at just the power and the importance of community, starting with your family, and then Richard, and then the women that you worked with, and then the community that you've impacted and that you've built. It's so easy for us to lose, I think, sight in, that narrative of I've done this all by myself. And you have accomplished a lot, but that power of community is so amazing.
Yeah, it's always been. And I think this is something that, Richard always said, and, my parents have always lived out this value. It's you treat your relationships like friendships, and just be really interested in meeting people. So, in my 20s, my late teens, early 20s, so the beginning of my entertainment career, I was going out to lunch with people. I was going out for dinner and drinks. I was hanging out. I was making friends. I was just interested in people for who they are, because music is such a small community. It's a very small, very, very small world, especially like LA music scene or like LA Sync, which is music for film and TV. That's music supervisors, your music editors, all the people who are working at the labels are the same people that were working at the labels like 10 years ago. And I know them. So it's like you see people like a certain generation kind of rise through the ranks and then just kind of stay in the mix for, years and years and years. So like there's a lot of longevity for music industry executives, or at least there always has been in my experience. But I think by 2020, because I'd been doing it, 2020, I was 27. I'd started at 17, done all the Oscar-winning soundtracks. I'd worked with every artist I wanted to work with. And then you go to events and you just see, again, that same community. And I realized, I was like, you know what? I can't imagine myself doing this same thing for an additional 30, 40 years. Like, I don't know if that's what I want. So in January of 2020, it was like right after Grammy week, I sent an email to my top like 2,000 industry contacts. And I was like, I'm doing social impacts now. All right. I'm technically not doing music anymore. I'm moving on to social impact now. Here's my new content information. Here's my new email. Here's my website. Let me know if you want help with social impact work. And I think that got like a huge, because I was looking at my open rate. My open rate was like 85% plus. And wow. I think one of the first people to get back to me was like Chance the Rapper's manager at the time. He was like, Godspeed. And I'm like, thanks, Pat. And people started hitting me up for projects, for anything impactful. Like I started working on, a thing for Malcolm X's daughter. I did some music supervision on a Celebration of Life, and it had like Common and Erykah Badu doing performances, and it was like a live stream thing. I worked on the election. So like from 2020 on, just that one email. That's all the customer acquisition I had to do, because I've just been working on word of mouth referral ever since. My entire social impact consulting career has just been on the back of sending that one email and people hitting me up.
With your social impact work, you come out of Weinstein, you do your marketing campaign, the single email marketing campaign. What were some of the challenges you started working on kind of right away? And then what was what emerged out of that in terms of your focus?
Right out the bat, like my first, because I worked on several projects in 2020. The biggest one was a Get Out the Vote campaign for the 2020 presidential election. Like, you can't talk about 2020 and not talk about Trump versus Biden. And that was huge. I was co-lead on a digital marketing campaign for a client's collective PAC, which is like one of the largest, or I think it's the largest Black super PAC in the nation. And their mission, which they executed that year, was registering 114,000 Black voters, right? So major, major push to get Black voters engaged, activated, registered to vote, prepared to vote. So we were producing content for their socials. We were creating, I was executive producing live streamed events. One with BET, that was Black Men Voting Forum. And that was like Common, Mark Lamont Hill, Shaka Sanger, Franklin Leonard, who does the Blacklist, a whole bunch of incredible activists and political figures. And then we also did Black Women Leading the Revolution, which is another live stream event. And that was Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. That was Black Lives Matter co-founder Opal Tometi. That was Brittany Packnett. And that was another amazing dialogue. We were thinking about how to directly message, though, Black voters who had felt like left out of the loop, who weren't being invested in. It was a massive campaign. And that was kind of like my first big campaign out the gate with this new consulting shingle that I had set up. And I worked with the amazing and, tragically, we lost him too soon. Michael Latt was the co-lead on that. So that was, and I met back in the Weinstein era because of Fruitvale Station, the Ryan Coogler film. So that was like the first big one, was working with Michael on that campaign. And then it just started to accelerate from there. By the end of 2020, I kind of felt like my differentiator in the impact space, which is very nascent at the time, everyone was just, it was 2020. Everyone was going like, in these trying times, we really care. We're making a big difference. We're impact. Da, da, da. I realized that what my focus should be was in validation. So it's not enough to just say you're making a big impact in the world. You have to prove it in terms of dollars and data. And that became like a driving thesis for my work. So in the years since, I have had clients that are in the entertainment industry, like Universal Music Group is a client on their foundation side. So I work with them on their impact reporting. I have a fund, I can't name the fund, but they're doing global economic development work in Ethiopia and doing a lot of work. Like we're touching, I think our impact metrics are like somewhere in the neighborhood of like 52,000 lives that we've directly impacted through building wash facilities, facilities for disabled children, schools, a lot of great stuff there. I've got a startup that is doing amazing work in the food equity space in Los Angeles, closing that food desert and food access gap. That's Prosperity Market. There's several others. I also serve on the board of Social Value International's U.S. chapter. I'm also the comms committee co-chair of that organization. And Social Value is kind of like a global organization that for decades has been furthering the work of how we account for social values. And when we think of like UNSDG or like IFRS, SASB, IASB accounting standards boards, and how we're actually reflecting social good on a balance sheet, like how do you account? How do you describe like the social return on investment for an impact investor? Like for every dollar you invest, what is the actual value being created? That is the work of that organization, which used to be the SROI network, even further back. So I'm part of leadership there, and I'm really honing in on this intersectional, industry agnostic sort of methodology for how I create impact with my clients, how I help them create impact, how I magnify and scale change to a systems level sort of thing. So that's very much my focus in all of the work that I do.
How do you think about, in 2020 and beyond, there was this surge in a lot of people talking about doing good and creating programs and spending money. But then, money's gotten a lot more expensive, all these competing priorities, and or people just can't keep up the veneer anymore, right? Like, how do you think about bringing about true change?
Yeah.
And yeah.
It's about alignment, right? And it goes back to this relationship thing. It goes back to like building real trust with the partners that you're working with, because at the end of the day, I believe, and this is kind of like a good faith consideration, people want a win. We usually want the same things. Like nobody wants suffering, right? If you want, I don't care, like the greediest CEO, I'm like, do you specifically want like these 20 children around the corner from your factory to die of cancer? Cool, you do? Great. Like, well, it's happening really quickly. So you're hitting that target. They don't want that. And usually there's a way, I think, to align different interests that we might see as opposed, like, the shareholders' interest in profit and a community's interest in their well-being and survival and maybe not dying of cancer or having, all their children have severe asthma for no reason other than the practices of this business over here. There's also the regulatory consideration. So I think aligning, mission and impact to the business case, being able to communicate about impact and community good and social value in the language of the boardroom or, your senior leadership team at an organization. I'm a big believer that if people and planet are served, you have a better environment for an investor or shareholder, because all of a sudden, if society has, greater stability and longevity, that's a better business environment. and it's just a better environment, point blank, period, for everybody.
Yeah.
So I do believe in the win-win, and I do believe in the idea of finding ways to bring people to the table through mutual incentives, or sort of from, more nuanced incentive structures that meet everybody's needs, or at least to an acceptable degree, where you're not creating outsized harms. So that harm reduction is a big angle in a lot of what I talk about. And also, how do we de-risk environments for better growth and more sustainable growth?
So how are you going about that with Norterra, with your tech startup?
Yeah, we're in the early phases where we're building a platform that basically enables companies and empowers, particularly like HR, DEI, senior leadership, to say, hey, if we build our organization to be inclusive and supportive of our team, if we have smart human capital management strategy, not only will we be more profitable, but we're also reducing our risk of being sued. So we're going to be taking a look at your data and saying, hey, based on your current practices, here's how you're performing on inclusion compared to your peers in your industry. And here's the likelihood it is that you're going to be sued by your employees for sexual harassment, discrimination, wrongful termination. Here's how we're going to help you reduce your, EPLI insurance premiums. Here's how we're going to, reduce your risk of litigation, like I said. Here's where we're going to make your, employees happier, more productive, and create, better brand longevity for you and your company, and better organizational longevity. So that's the focus of that company. And really, it's taking the thesis of creating systemic change and saying, okay, how do we take sort of these principles that I have, that my co-founders have developed in their careers, and how do we systematize it? How do we create a product that can scale and create organizational transformation through this lens of like a P&L bias and looking at risk mitigation and looking at all these different things, risk mitigation and compliance, which are very boring, dry topics. But when you take a different approach, when you connect it to different systems and methodologies, which we're, developing as well, I think you can do something really exciting in the economy. And I'm kind of looking forward long-term to having that sort of effect on the American workplace, because it's ripe for disruption.
100%. Yeah. It's that dry, boring contract that's sitting in the bottom of a dusty cardboard box, right?
Yeah. That you don't realize
it's sitting right there.
It's millions of dollars just like rotting, and there are moths in it. It's like all these little things that it's easy to disregard. It's easy to disregard the potential of a bunch of bankers' boxes. It's easy to disregard the random LinkedIn DM or email outreach like, hey, can we get coffee? It's easy to disregard these little things, but the little things make everything. They add up. So you have to pay attention and you have to care, because if you don't, the world will continue to change. You'll be frustrated by these big problems, not recognizing that the constituent parts to every big problem that we deal with are these like little mundane, very human, very interpersonal things. And if you just pay attention to these little details, you can create a roadmap to creating large scale change. I'm a big believer in everything that I say, clearly. It's how I've lived my life.
Yeah.
And so far, it's been working out pretty darn good. So I'm going to stick with it.